Hello, my name is Tom Larkin, and I work for Snowflake as a platforms engineer. I've been in IT for over 20 years now, which makes me feel kind of old. My team consists of 4 engineers and 1 sysadmin, split between the US and India. And I've been at Snowflake since January 2019, and it has been quite the ride so far. So, what is Snowflake? Snowflake is a highly scalable data cloud platform that is available in multiple cloud offerings. It's a fully managed service right in the cloud. Snowflake is your solution for data warehousing, data lakes, data engineering, data science, data application development, and securely sharing and consuming data within our platform. The elasticity of the cloud and Snowflake could scale and exceed all your data needs in the IT operations world. Throughout my career, I've managed hundreds of thousands of servers, and with cloud offerings like Snowflake, IT and operations shops don't have to deploy, patch, maintain, scale, or be on be on call for infrastructure fires when you host things on-prem. So this is a definition that I got off of Google Web Search of what it means to be data-driven. So let's just go through the slides here and find out how accurate this definition is. So a little bit about the presentation here. I'm going to cover some high-level topics. This talk is heavily summarized in some areas, and that's due to time constraints compounded by the near endless things you can do with data. So I will only be touching on a few subjects around data, but then drilling down into a lot of IT operational specific ones. So let's dive into some data concepts. When you begin your data journey, you will learn a plethora of things as you progress. You will often find in the beginning that you might be wrong, and it happens to all of us. It happened to me, and I really can't stress this enough. There were a few things I had thought for years were decent enough to solid workflows and concepts, but the data eventually showed me the flaws in my methods. And this has allowed me as an IT operations professional to learn new things, sometimes every day, and it never stops. Also, in the beginning, it may be difficult to estimate and articulate what exactly IT operations can do with data. I've been interested in data for years, even before I worked at Snowflake, and at previous jobs I was exposed to multiple data tools and data warehouse solutions. But back then I didn't quite know what to do or what my end goals were because I was just in the beginning of my journey. So if you aren't sure where to start, this is kind of my high-level starter pack of all the systems that you should ship to a centralized data platform and you can leverage in your data workflows. This slide is a high-level overview of just data flow from end to end, from data source to data consumption. And this is such a massive topic, so I'm just going to touch on it briefly. And Snowflake is no different. We have many ways to ingest and work with data. So kind of on the left to the right here, you'll see all your data sources. They come in through some sort of ingestion pipeline. Once they get into the data warehouse, there's a whole bunch of warehouse management you can do. And then from there, you can transform the data, model the data, and then at the very end, you can visualize it for easy consumption. And cloud-based data platforms, things like scale and capacity that were once big issues with on-prem solutions don't really exist in the cloud. Our data platform has over 250 petabytes of data in it with over 515 million data workloads executed per day. So when you think about it and you want to ship your 20 gig to 40 gig Jamf Pro database to a product like Snowflake, in the grand scheme of things, that really isn't big data. That's just a bunch of data. Our Jamf Pro data set is about 200 gigs, and we've ingested almost 100 million Jamf Pro webhooks currently into our platform. The next thing I want to touch on is, data by itself is not as useful with data as data with context. And then data applied to sources of truth with baselines is much more valuable. This table is just a few examples of what data, of how you can classify data and how you can leverage data in your organization. So for example, your File Vault 2 disk encryption, right? So that's going to be a baseline because that might be a requirement, or it might be a desired end state. Your source of truth will be, where that data comes from. And then applying context to it is understanding what the data means and applying real world situations and joining it to other data sets for comparison. So filtering data by context is the next topic. So when we talk about context, right, you can talk about different employee types, active devices, inactive devices, company or employees that have left the company, and then asset type like primary, secondary, testing, server, network switch, so on and so forth. Within your asset tracking system, you create these contexts. Here's an example of some of our asset states in ServiceNow. And when we make a change in ServiceNow, we make our data better and more actionable. That data is then ingested into Snowflake, and we can leverage it immediately. Design is still very relevant and important in your data journey. You will redesign old systems that make data sets less difficult to understand into your data and make it more actionable. So here's a high-level example of what a data asset set might look like. Every employee must have a primary asset. That's a baseline, right? Asset states are defined in our asset tracker. That's a context. And then asset data will be used to join to other data sources. And then, of course, when we change an asset status in our asset tracker upstream, downstream, it gets ingested into Snowflake, and you can leverage the data immediately. So let's go look about how you can visualize it, gain insights, consume it, and use multiple data sources. So Jamf webhook data, probably pretty popular. It comes right out of the box with Jamf. And event data is great for many reasons. Events are typically shipped near real time or very quickly. And events are usually triggered from the application side in most cases and not from the client. Events can give you insights to actions or workflows that are going on, and they are usually just tiny structured data sets of JSON or XML or something similar. And of course, you can take action on event because an event occurred. So here is a dashboard that is powered by Jamf webhooks. And we consume and store all webhooks just indefinitely. And what this dashboard kind of tells us is how many policies and inventories and enrollments that our Jamf Cloud is performing. And also like all the API integrations, like how many API calls are we calling for an integration. And we can track kind of the metrics so we don't maybe DDoS ourselves or run into an API rates limiting situation, which can cause issues. And my one story to this is I did actually have an API workflow break on me about 2 years ago, which resulted in a smart group and a policy, both installing different versions of the same app. And so it generated 80,000 recons in a day, and I wouldn't have caught that without this dashboard. So let's look at a webhook example. This is the anatomy of a webhook if it were like a file on disk or stored in memory. It's just essentially two high-level keys with a bunch of nested key values in a JSON document. And, Snowflake can consume JSON data natively. JSON is pretty easy to parse, and in the grand scheme of things, JSON is really tiny. So when we look at like tracking events and what we can do with events, here's an event-based query and dashboards we have in our product. And as you can see, this is to track the operating system's upgrading in real time. So when a device upgrades the operating system and restarts, we do a recon at restart. That recon then ships a webhook event to Snowflake, and we're able to track our entire fleet's operating system, just in general and by department, by user. We have all that data in there. Have you ever wondered how many of your primary, secondary devices aren't checking into MDM? Instead of going into Jamf to run a bunch of saved searches or have smart groups or write an API code and integration, You can simply just consume the webhooks because if the client isn't checking in, it's not shipping an event. And this allows us to catch failures with Jamf agents or MDM is just in a bad state, and you just need to re-enroll the device or maybe have the user reboot. But tracking this data is very useful because you can then track over time how things fail or what each failure is, and you can open up help desk tickets and the like. This next visualization is just third-party software visualization. And the great thing about Snowflake here is the data sharing. So you can do this in Jamf, but Jamf has no knowledge of a primary system, a secondary system, a demo system, a testing system. And when you join your data from your asset tracker, you can get drilled down into that level, which is very nice. So this is a very interesting slide. Back in Q1 of this year, we deployed an application that was tied to a pretty big initiative. It was to go passwordless with an MTLS application. So this meant if the app had issues, it would break people's ability to authenticate to our IDP, and that would block them from doing their day-to-day work. So we tracked the app version over time, along with policies deployed and tickets opened. And what we would do with this data is like when the vendor would release a new version or fix a bug, we would reference the release notes, and then we would reference our help desk tickets, and then go back in time to see how many devices were running that version with that known issue. And this has helped our TPMs gain insight to the overall project and engage with our vendor on giving more accurate feedback to software bugs and issues that we were observing. So these visualizations are really about failure, and this is why failure is important. So at the top tile, you'll see it's our File Vault 2 status across our fleet. And the bottom slide is around devices that are shipping MDM events but don't have valid asset records in ServiceNow. So if I were to sit up here and try to tell y'all that we don't have any failure rates and everything's great, I'd probably be laughed off this virtual stage. Every org and every platform experiences failures. But having data like this allows you to be proactive about these failures and fix these failures ahead of time. And this is all because we can centralize all our data sources. So going back to where I mentioned I was wrong, it was around tracking, health checking, and ensuring functionality of third-party agents that we deploy to our fleet. Some of you today might write scripts or use config management tools, deploy launch daemons, or use data collection things like extension attributes, and then smart groups to try to fix these broken agents or health check these agents. These methods aren't bad by any means, but I have found they are far from perfect. And agents and binaries can give false positives and false negatives. And there's a lot of effort to get through the noise to the root cause of why an agent might be failing. Therefore, I have completely changed my view on this approach, and my view now is simply, if an agent is not submitting data to the cloud, then that agent is considered to be in a broken state. So we've all worked with various third-party agents in IT, whether it be security or IT operations or maybe another automation tool. And, we can just go over these really quick. So we know that security agents are complex, right? They have things like kernel extensions and system extensions, and they require a lot of extra effort by IT to deploy and maintain. We also know that vendors don't often have a turnkey solution. They may supply a non-standard installer package. They may have a weird deployment method. They may have no common integration to other tools or products. So in the end, tracking all this cloud data really becomes key to really understanding the functionality of these agents. So this is a very favorite graph of mine. And notice how there's a flat line between August and October. And this is data from last year. This was during the Big Sur release. So we were tracking agent failures after Big Sur. And as you notice that kind of after the middle of October, or maybe towards November, when Big Sur came out, we saw a big, not a big spike, but we saw a decent spike of failures. And our vendors were, patching their software and fixing bugs as they found them. But this was really cool just to track how something was functional at the release of a new operating system. So we've learned a lot about third-party agents that we've collected and that we deploy here, and I've collaborated with our security teams a ton. This has strengthened our relationship between IT and security and solidified our partnership. My legacy methods were not as effective as using native cloud data for agent health checks, and that's now our gold standard that we use. I also have a new favorite thing I can do that I was never able to do before in my entire career. And that is I can open a support ticket with a vendor, describe my problem, and I can supply the vendor data. And then typically the vendor will come back and start asking questions, and they will always inevitably ask me this same question every time. Well, where did you get the data from? And my favorite answer is, well, I got the data from you. This is your data in our product. And that never gets old because I just never was able to do it before. So now let's talk about some data sharing. Some people who are watching this might get this reference. It comes from an old job of mine where we used to use this phrase a lot, and I am going to paraphrase it. We in IT need to take the approach of making things easier for others and not easier for ourselves. Data sharing gives you so much insight to all your tech that you are given the opportunity to make things easier for everyone you work with simply by using, sharing, and consuming data. It also can help drive a better user experience by consuming this data and correlating it to things like tickets and surveys and feedback and things like that. When you have access to all the data you need in a centralized platform, it really empowers IT to do a lot of things that weren't really possible before. So now let's talk about some data sharing. So securely sharing your data internally can be a challenge. We approach this by using RBAC and assigning roles to define data sets for specific business needs. You can have read roles, read-only roles, data modeling roles, admin roles, full data access roles, so on and so forth. There's a lot of combinations you can do with role-based access. When you want to classify your data in a context of sensitive, private, or crown jewels, for example, you can then create roles and share only the data you want to those roles and still use the rule of sharing with least privilege. Benefits with data sharing are pretty endless. I make this joke with our security teams all the time that I have indirectly learned more about our security tooling than I ever set out to actually do. When you empower someone with deep systems knowledge, like an IT operations engineer, to security data, you end up learning so much more about the product and tools they're using. And this means that you can create better workflows, ensure higher level of compliance to your fleet, and also, data sharing solves an age-old annoyance of mine. The days of emailing spreadsheets between IT teams and external teams is no longer there. You just data share directly within the product. Or maybe you don't have to write some API integration and maintain that to get data from someone else in a middleware or external system. So Snowflake is SQL. You will have to learn some SQL, but I trust me, it's not that hard. This query is an example that consists of data sharing from 3 sources of truth: Jamf, ServiceNow, and our HR data. Leveraging all this work we put into our data sets now has a very large return on investment. In this query, I am only filtering for primary and secondary devices assigned to employees. I am getting the absolute latest data from Jamf from a webhook. And then I am joining that to HR data to make sure they're still employed. This is typically about as complex as my queries get. A lot of my queries are more simple than this, I might have a query that might dive a bit more into complexity than this, but I just wanted to demonstrate that, you know, these queries aren't too impossible to learn. So, some key takeaways. I would say the internet's definition of being data driven was pretty accurate as we trek through my slide deck here. Centralizing and sharing your data is so valuable, and I can't stress this enough. I have never had a job where I had this much access to so much different data sets or sources of truth. It's really a massive game changer. And with cloud-based platforms like Snowflake, there's no knobs to adjust. There's no database configs to manage and deploy. There's no disaster recovery or HA or failover to build. Snowflake does all that heavy lifting for you. So as an IT professional, you can concentrate on using the data instead of spending all your time putting out infrastructure fires or being on call 24/7. Here goes some additional resources to my talk. There's some Snowflake links in there. I have my blog in here. I will have a companion GitHub repo for this talk. And if you want to contact me, there's my Mac admin and my Twitter handle. And thanks for coming.